and welcome to a very special presentation given by Pyramid One Radio International Network. This is being brought to you from Edgar Cayce's ARE Houston Center in Houston, Texas. The speakers are John Bunker and Karen Pressler. It's about the Sphinx and the Lost Hall of Records. Relax. Listen. Learn.
Thanks everybody for coming. We experienced a slight delay here because of our technical issues, but I think we're working now. My name is John Bunker, and this is Karen Pressler. And we started on this research 21 years ago, and it's taken us a long time to get everything put together for this presentation. But today we're going to be telling everyone for the first time what we've discovered, and we're live on the Pyramid One Internet Radio right now, which is broadcast into many countries, including the United States and Australia and many other countries. So I'm going to go ahead and get started today. And I wrote everything down so I wouldn't have to remember it. So if I'm not looking up at you, it's not because I don't care, it's because I'm trying to cover everything. So here we go. The discovery of Edgar Cayce's Hall of Records. The Egyptians wrote about the stars in a book we call Amduat. The book itself claims to be the book of praises of the other world above. Here is how it begins. Seshu Natu Eha Amet Ba Neturu Kabit Ku Aru Hat Upt Ament Seba and Akut Ament Pe Sma'u Keku Seba Akut Ament. In English, that means the writings and paintings of the hidden positions of the souls, gods, shadows, spirits. Forms beginning daily, the hidden star of the hidden horizon ends the utter darkness. The star of the horizon of the abode of the dead. This is the true story of our discovery of the Hall of Records. It began in Chicago in the spring of 1994. We were in a used bookstore with our friend Matthew Block, and we purchased a book titled The Story of Edgar Cayce by Thomas Segru. And so we became acquainted with Edgar Cayce. In December of 1994, I received the complete Edgar Cayce readings on CD-ROM as a gift from Karen. Thereafter, I studied Cayce readings at every opportunity. I learned that Cayce experienced an incarnation in ancient Egypt as a high priest at the beginning of the Egyptian civilization in remote antiquity. There were many readings about the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids. I found myself seeking other sources of historical information about ancient Egypt, and I purchased many books on that subject. There was so much to learn. In the readings, Cayce referred to the Sphinx as the mystery. This led us to discover the ancient Egyptian word Sheta, which means mystery. After that, we began to learn the picture symbols that the ancient Egyptians used to write their language. This was the beginning of our education of reading and writing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. I spent many months filling the pages of spiral notebooks with images of hieroglyphs, writing them over and over and over again, learning the Egyptian alphabet. During those first 5 years, we made many trips to Chicago to visit used bookstores to find books about Edgar Cayce. In fact, we learned so much about Edgar Cayce that we wrote our first book about him and published it in 1999, Edgar Cayce and the Urantia Book. During those years, Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval released their books, The Mystery of the Sphinx and The Secret Chamber. Graham Hancock is also known for his television documentary series, Quest for the Lost Civilization. During one of the episodes on his laptop computer, he used the shareware program SkyGlow, with which the positions of stars could be viewed as they were in ancient times. We located this same computer shareware program on the internet and downloaded it and learned to use it. Over the next 15 years, we immersed ourselves into the study of the Edgar Cayce readings, astronomy, and ancient Egyptian texts. I now recall that Cayce had said, "Yet, as time draws nigh when changes are to come about, there may be the opening of those three places where the records are won, to those that are the initiates in the knowledge of the one God." I wondered if the three places referred to by the readings were the readings themselves, astronomy, and the ancient Egyptian texts. Until now, no one had combined the study of these three topics. Almost everyone in this day and age has heard of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Many people have also heard of Edgar Cayce. But few people have studied the Edgar Cayce material very closely. For this reason, the misinterpretation was made that a tunnel from the right paw of the Sphinx leads to the Hall of Records. Here's what Cayce said on July 1st, 1932. "When there was the entrance of Era art and Era art, they began to build upon those mounds that were discovered through research. With the storehouse or record house, where the records are still to be uncovered, there is a chamber, or passage from the right forepaw to this entrance of the record chamber, or record 2. This may not be entered without an understanding, for those that were left as guards may not be passed until after a period of their regeneration in the mount, or the fifth root race begins. At some time, someone read this paragraph and saw the phrase, passage from the right forepaw to this entrance of the record chamber, and they concluded that there was a tunnel from the paw of the monument of the Great Sphinx to the Hall of Records. The rest of the paragraph was ignored because no one could understand it. That is why, even unto this day, people continue to look for the Hall of Records under the Sphinx, but it may never be found there. Christiane Zibi-Coche, in her book Sphinx, History of a Monument, says, even in Maspero's day, subterranean chambers were imagined to lie underneath the Sphinx. Not until the last decades of the 20th century did electromagnetic resistivity testing on the surfaces of the statue put an end to these allegations. During this presentation, we will provide information from three places that support a single idea: the location of Edgar Cayce's Hall of Records. We will look closely at Cayce's readings and compare them with information from ancient Egyptian texts found in the Valley of the Kings of Egypt. We will also compare these ideas with astronomy. When we do this, an entirely new idea develops about the location of the Hall of Records. In reading 5748-6, Cayce said, "This may not be entered without an understanding, for those who were left as guards may not be passed until after a period of their regeneration in mount, or the fifth root race begins. So we ask ourselves, when will the fifth root race begin? Has anyone ever wondered that? Earlier in this same reading, and we're talking about reading 5748-6, Casey explained that the beginning of a new subrace or a change which, as indicated from the astronomical or numerical conditions, dates from the latter portions or the middle portions of the present fall, there will be the beginning of the change in the races. The changes as identified and outlined are for the present year. Casey gave this reading in the summer of 1932, and his prediction for the beginning of the fifth root race was, at that time, for a future event, the autumn of 1932. That is why the beginning of the fifth root race is presented as a futuristic event. To those present with Casey at the time of this reading, he was predicting a future event. This explains the first of two conditions necessary for the eventual entrance into the Hall of Records. It was fulfilled in 1932. The second condition is the attainment of a special knowledge. Here is how Casey said it. This may not be entered without an understanding, for those who were left as guards may not be passed until after a period of their regeneration in the mount. Understanding this mysterious message is necessary before the Hall of Records may be entered. Let's reason this out together. The guards who were left may be passed after they are regenerated in the mount. That's all we got to do is regenerate the guards in the mount, right? That's what Casey's telling us. That's when the Hall of Records can be entered. But who or what were these guards? Part of this understanding is to recognize that there was more than one guard. On July 1st, 1932, Casey identified those who were left as guards as a group in a plural sense. There's no mistaking this. In his 1949 book, The Sphinx, Its History in Light of Recent Excavations, Salim Hassan explains, Sphinxes are always found in pairs when guarding temple doorways. Now I want you all to remember this little bit of information because later it's going to prove to be very important. I'll read it one more time. Sphinxes are always found in pairs when guarding temple doorways. More than a year later, on October 29, 1933, Casey made another statement about the Sphinx. He identified it in this way. The Sphinx that was later set as the sentinel or guard in a singular sense. And he indicated that it was created at a later date. So are you starting to see here we're talking about different guards, not just one guard. In July 1st of 1932, Casey says those who were left as guards. He's talking about a group of guards in a plural sense. And then over a year later, on October 29th of 1933, Casey says the Sphinx that was later set as a sentinel or guard. Anybody ever catch that before? Okay, then we'll move on. The implication is this. Before the Sphinx was set as a guard, other guards were already guarding the Hall of Records. recall that within the readings, Casey referred to the Sphinx as the mystery. In reading 5748-6, paragraph 17, Casey said, "In the building of the pyramid, and that which is now called the mystery of mysteries, this was intended to be a memorial, as would be termed today, to that counselor who ruled or governed or who acted in the capacity of the director in the material things in the land. With the return of the priest, as it hadn't stopped, this was later by Isis, the queen or daughter of Ra, turned so as to present to those peoples in that land the relationships of man and the animal or carnal world, with those changes that fade or fall away in their various effect. These may be seen in a different manner presented in many of the various sphinxes as called in other portions of the land, as the lion with the man, the various forms of wing or characterizations in their various developments. These were as presentations of those projections that had been handed down in their various developments of that which becomes man, as in the present." Look at what is hidden in this reading. The mystery of mysteries, that's the Sphinx, was later turned. It means it was changed so as to present the lion with the man. This information caused us to study the Sphinx chronology closely. And that's what we're going to talk about right now, the Sphinx chronology. Referring again to the book Sphinx, History of a Monument, Christie Ann Z.V. Crochet states, "There are no references to the Sphinx in documents of the Old Kingdom, and during the Middle Kingdom the site of Giza was almost abandoned. Mark later, Egyptologist and former ARE member, stated, 'We are confronted by a complete absence of Old Kingdom texts which mention it.'" Don't you think if the ancient Egyptians built the Sphinx, they would have written something about it? Duh. Perhaps the ancient Egyptians of the Old Kingdom did write about the Sphinx, but maybe they called it something else. Maybe they called it the mystery. That's what Casey called it. Casey advised, "Study the Book of the Dead, though this is given as being prepared at a much later date than in reality." What Casey's telling us here is that the Book of the Dead originated at a very, very remote date. And it's so far back that no one knows when it started. So what Karen and I did is we searched the original Egyptian hieroglyphic texts of the Book of the Dead. Since Casey used mystery as another name for the Sphinx, we looked for that word, and here's what we found. Lion mystery is the name of this one guard. There it is, and that's how they wrote it. And it's real easy to understand. Here's another thing we found. The secret chamber and the mysterious statue of a god of the necropolis. Now, we've been studying this stuff for 21 years, and so we're not going to present everything to the nth degree, because if we did, you would all fall asleep or have to go to the bathroom or something. So we're just going to touch on some of the main things, okay? The readings explain that originally the head of the Sphinx stood alone as a monument. It was the face of a great counselor who worked for the king of Egypt. Centuries later, the body of a lion was sculpted under it by excavation. Reading 457-2, paragraph 11, describes a gathering of people for the sealing of the Hall of Records in the area of land between those two landmarks, the facing of what afterwards became the Sphinx and Holy Mount. And that reading says, all gathered about that plat, and the plat is an area of land, builded in the holy city between the facing of what afterwards became the Sphinx and the Holy Mount. So all the people in ancient times gathered between these two structures for the sealing of the Hall of Record. What was the facing of the Sphinx? Here are several statements from the readings that relate to the face of the Sphinx. Number one, the facing of what afterward became the Sphinx. Number two, the face, even as was given then, is the representation of this counselor. Number three, this was later turned so as to present the lion with the man. Reading 195-14, paragraph 19, explains how the body of the Sphinx was created centuries after the face. It explains there was a man named Arsha who came into Egypt with the arrival of Arart and his people from the north, who invaded Egypt and took control. This is about 11,017 BC. Arsha lived during the first dynasty of Arart and his son, Arart. During this initial period, there was the restoration of monuments that were discovered through research. When these people first got to the Nile Valley, there were already monuments there that they excavated. Monuments were pre-existent at Giza before the arrival of the first Egyptian dynasty, the remains of an unknown, vanished civilization. Reading 195-14 also gives an indication that the time involved in the development of the monument of the Sphinx took place over centuries. Construction of the Great Pyramid was begun at about the same time as the deluge of Atlantis. The Great Pyramid was completed in 10,390 BC. Upon its completion, there was the sealing of the Hall of Records, when all gathered between the facing of what afterwards became the Sphinx and the Holy Mount. The readings specify several hundred years passed after the deluge before excavations were made to dig out the base of the Sphinx. This indicates the lion body was added later under the monument of the face of the counselor. In this third illustration here at the bottom, you can see how the rock of the plateau was removed and cut away to leave the body of the lion. The readings explain that the sculpting of the head monument, which eventually was turned into the Sphinx, happened before the political turmoil involving the priest Rata. If you're not familiar with who the priest Rata is, you can go in and read the Edgar Casey readings and find out who Rata was. He was the first high priest of Egypt. He was an incarnation of Edgar Casey. Because of the resulting chaos, the work on the head monument, already in progress, had stopped. Rata was banished to Nubia. 9 years passed, and he returned to Egypt. Thereafter, the Great Pyramid was built. With the completion of Giza, there were ceremonies of dedication and the sealing of the Hall of Records. Centuries later, the monument of the counselor was turned into what became known as the Sphinx. by excavating the body of a lion under it. This is what is meant by reading 5748-6, where Casey said, the Sphinx that was later set as the sentinel or guard. To reiterate, the second condition necessary to enter the Hall of Records was the attainment of a special knowledge. Here is how Casey stated it. This may not be entered without an understanding, for those who were left as guards may not be passed until after a period of their regeneration in the mount. But who were the other guards, here referred to by Casey in 1932, over a year before he mentioned the Sphinx? And how can these guards be regenerated? I have to admit, for many, many years, I was stumped by this. By definition, to regenerate means to bring into renewed existence, or generate again. To what monument was Casey referring when he said the guards' regeneration in the mount? Researched the Edgar Casey readings and discovered reading 254-101, in which he described the mount. Thou hast shown us the pattern in the mount of our own consciousness. We realized that the mount is within us, within our minds. Then we understood that the identity of the guards must be realized within us. This knowledge of the identity of the guards must have been previously known, but over time it was lost or forgotten. So what Casey meant was that our recognition of the guards is their regeneration. But who or what were the guards? Earlier in reading 5748-6, Casey used the phrase as indicated by the astronomical. This is an allusion to astronomy, and it suggested to us that there may be a connection between the guards and the stars, because the ancient Egyptians combined astronomy with religion. So we reasoned, if we thought in terms of astronomy, we might have a better chance of understanding their religious ideas. The Papyrus of Ani is the largest and most perfect and best illustrated of all the papyri containing copies of the Theban recension of the Book of the Dead, and was written between 1500 BC and 1350 BC. In the Papyrus of Ani, we find the double lion god comes forth in the sky. It's pretty plain, isn't it? This is an image from an ancient Egyptian book painted in the tombs of the kings of Egypt. In the center is a mysterious oval that rests on the bodies of two sphinxes. This is a good place to remember something I told you at the beginning, to remember what Salim Hassan said in his 1949 book. The Sphinx were always found in pairs when guarding temple doorways. Does everybody remember that? Hieroglyphic text, not shown here. They erased all the hieroglyphic text out because it really jumbled everything up. But hieroglyphic text painted in the original tomb describes these two sphinxes as the guards. What if this image has some sort of astronomical connection? Since Casey said the sealing of the Hall of Records was at the completion of Giza in 10,390 BC, we decided to begin looking at the positions of stars during that year. Using a computer to recreate the positions of the stars to their same positions as they were in those ancient times, we discovered that the two sphinxes in the tomb drawing were in fact star constellations at opposite ends of the horizon, represented in the tomb drawing by an oval. The oval is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic word for horizon. So that's a word, it says horizon. The winged serpent in the constellation, the winged serpent constellation in this drawing is Hydra at its zenith. Zenith means the highest point in the sky the constellation reaches. This configuration of stars and planets took place over Giza on a specific date. And by using astronomy, we can identify the date and time, September 21st, 10,390 BC at 4:50 a.m. over Cairo, just before sunrise. This is the whole sky picture compared with the tomb of Tutmosis III. In the top register here, we have the tomb painting that shows these characters with which we are discussing. We have removed characters that we're not talking about at this point. The center image, we've taken the two lions and the flying serpent and we put them over their respective constellations. And we've also taken the star and the serpent and we've placed them over their respective places. Then, at the bottom illustration, starting on the right side, we have the constellation of Serpens, which is Latin for serpent. Then we have the star of Vega, and at that time on that date, that was the brightest star in the sky. If you looked north in the sky at that time, your attention would be drawn to Vega because it was the brightest thing you could see. But then if you turned around and looked the other way behind you, you would see these two lion constellations, Leo and Centaurus, with this big flying serpent in between them, constellation of Hydra. And at the end of the tail of Hydra, at that time, on that date, was the planet Venus. Casey said, with the storehouse or record house, where the records are still to be uncovered, there is a chamber. Let's reconsider his words in the context of the language used within the body of the readings. The next two readings identify pyramids as storehouses. Number one, those storehouses in those pyramids or mounds yet to be uncovered. That's reading 1925-1, paragraph 10. Number two, the entity saw what was preserved as memorials. The pyramids built during the entity's sojourn when there was begun the Pyramid of Understanding, or Giza. In case if there was any confusion, the readings are telling us we're talking about Giza here, okay? They even say Giza. And only to the king's chamber was the pathway built. The entity's harps and the entity's menus, as they were termed in the present, are among those things preserved in the pyramid of unknown origin, as yet, in the storehouse of records. In this reading, Casey is talking about pyramids at Giza. The first pyramid referred to is the Great Pyramid. It can be identified by the mention of the king's chamber. The other pyramid he identified is the storehouse of records, which is also the hall of records. Consider this. There are only 3 great pyramids at Giza, and here they are. that the Pyramid of Records must be either Khafre's pyramid or Menkaura's pyramid. But how do we know which one? Casey gives us further information about the Hall of Records by identifying its relationship to its position with the Sphinx and the Sphinx Causeway. And here's what that reading says. Where are those records or tablets made of that Egyptian experience that I might study? The answer that Casey gave was, in the Tomb of Records, as indicated. For the entity's tomb then was a part of the Hall of Records, which has not yet been uncovered. It lies between or along that entrance from the Sphinx to the temple or the pyramid, in a pyramid, of course, of its own. Here you can see that the Pyramid of Khafre is still covered at the top with the original casing stone, satisfying the condition of not yet uncovered. If the top of the pyramid was built at a much later date than the bottom, as it seems to have been, then it is a pyramid of its own on the top. So here's what Casey said about the Hall of Records. It lies along the entrance from the Sphinx to the temple or the pyramid, in a pyramid, of course, of its own. You see, you can see here in this illustration that the Pyramid of Khafre was built in two separate parts. In reading 1486-1, Casey said, the chambers of the way, here's the causeway, the way between the Sphinx and the Pyramid of Records. Casey also said in reading 2012-1, the place of records that leadeth from the Sphinx to the Hall of Records in the Egyptian land. In describing the location of the Hall of Records, Casey also said, this imposition lies as the sun rises from the waters. At that time in history, the River Nile was much, much closer to the Giza Plateau than it is today. Today it's 5 miles away from the Sphinx. The course of the Nile has moved during the last 12,000 years. This imposition lies as the sun rises from the waters, the line of shadow falls between the paws of the Sphinx, which was later set as the sentinel or guard. Look what lies just beyond the Sphinx. The alignment of the sun with the paws of the Sphinx lines up with the Pyramid of Khafre. In another reading, Casey said, the temples of records that lie just beyond that enigma that is still the mystery of mysteries. Reviewing again exactly what Casey said on October 29, 1933, in reading 378-16, paragraph 11, this imposition lies as the sun rises from the water, the line of shadow falls between the paws of the Sphinx that was later set as the sentinel or guard. Now, this is a really condensed illustration here, but the distance between the Sphinx and the pyramid is about a quarter mile. And that's the area that all the people gathered into for the ceremony of the sealing of the Hall of Records when there was just the head of the Sphinx and the body hadn't yet been added. If an observer were standing between the Sphinx and the river, the line of the observer's shadow would fall between the paws of the Sphinx, making an alignment with the pyramid where the sealed room is located. But, somebody said, but, what about the idea that the Hall of Records may be entered from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx's right paw? Right, Ed? Does this mean there is a tunnel from the paw of the Sphinx to the Hall of Records? Or could it have another meaning? Let's return to reading 5748-6, number 7, where Casey said, when there was the entrance of Era-Art and his son, Era-Art, they began to build upon those mounds, which were discovered through research, with the storehouse or record house where the records are still to be uncovered. There is a chamber or passage from the right forepaw to this entrance of the record chamber or record tomb. The idea is cleverly presented here that the storehouse or record house was built upon the mounds. You see it? They began to build upon those mounds. The storehouse was built upon a mound. Let's examine some other possibilities. Casey indicated that there were many examples of sphinxes in Egypt, not just one. In this same reading, 5748-6, he said, these may be seen in a different manner presented in many of the various sphinxes as called in other portions of the land. Look at that. If we're dealing with more than one sphinx in connection with the Hall of Records, we need to identify it. To do this, we should ask, of the various sphinxes in Egypt, and these are just a few, there are legion, which one is located in a position with its right paw pointing toward the entrance of a chamber in a pyramid? The answer can be found hidden in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, where there is an illustration of two Sphinx guardians in a chamber within the top of a pyramid. You can see the pyramid right above it, whose right paw points the way to a sealed entrance. Casey said that record for future entering souls will be physically known when time has set its mark. What exactly is the mark of time that Casey was talking about? Earlier, Casey said the Hall of Records may not be entered until the time has been fulfilled. What exactly does that mean? One synonym for the word fulfilled is the word realized. That's the main synonym for that word, realized. So what Casey may have been saying is that the time needed to be realized. And when we thought about this, we understood that the mark of time was the date. In this case, the date is the sealing of the Hall of Records, September 21st, 10,390 BC over Giza at 4:50 a.m., just before sunrise. This is how the sky looked. This is a 360-degree view. If you're standing at Giza before sunrise on that day. The ancient kings of Egypt illustrated these star configurations in their tombs for over 300 years. As has been presented today to you folks, this date is known by means of information from three places: astronomy, the ancient Egyptian text, and the Edgar Casey readings. When asked for the exact date of the construction of the Great Pyramid, Casey said it was begun in 10,490 BC and was completed in 10,390 BC. He further stated, at the completion of Giza, there was the sealing of the Hall of Records, and all the people gathered about for this record sealing. This was a pretty big event for its day. When we look at the tombs of the ancient kings of Egypt, we find they consistently marked the year 10,390 BC, but until now, it hadn't been recognized. To see the connection with the astronomy of the ancient Egyptians, their mythology must be taken into consideration. One of the most prominent Egyptian myths was that of the daily battle of the sun god against Apep, an evil god depicted as a great serpent that was the deification of darkness and chaos. Ra had to do battle with him every single day before the sun could rise from the east. But every day the sun won the battle. Babylonians called it Sergal, the great snake. In this Babylonian star chart from 2084 BC, it is shown as a winged serpent, which proves that astronomers illustrated it in this way in very ancient times. The Phoenicians also illustrated Hydra as a winged serpent in this 1200 BC Phoenician star chart, and they called it Nakhash Meng, the snake, or the great snake. It was called Hydra, the water snake, by the Greeks who conquered Egypt in 336 BC. Now I want to tell you something here. The reason we have Greek names for the star constellations is because the Greeks conquered Egypt. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 336 BC. And so, the ruling power were the Greeks, and the names they gave to the star constellations superseded the original names that the Egyptians had given them, because they were the ruling political power after they took over Egypt. But that's the reason for the difference. Finally, in the 17th century, stellar cartographers Flamsteed and Hevelius broke old Hydra into Sextans, the sextant, Crater the cup, and Corvus the crow, and a new reduced Hydra. If we look at the Egyptian myth of the battle between the great serpent and the sun god in the context of astronomy, we can see that on September 21st, 10,390 BC, Hydra reached its highest position in the sky before dawn. When the sun rose, Hydra disappeared. This was the reason for the creation of the legend of the battle between the sun god and the great evil serpent Apep. It was developed to preserve the date of the sealing of the Hall of Records. Sir Norman Lockyer, 1836 to 1920, one of the major English astronomers of his time, in 1890 became interested in a problem which had also attracted Isaac Newton, that of bringing in astronomy to assist the chronology of history. Lockyer derived his conclusions about the astronomical character of the Egyptian religion on the solidest architectural measurements and astronomical calculations. As he carried out his research, it soon became obvious to him that their mythology was intensely astronomical. In 1894, he published his study of astronomy and mythology of the ancient Egyptians. You may have heard of this book, The Dawn of Astronomy. If you haven't read it, I'd suggest it. Lockyer proved that by knowing the position a star rose on the horizon, the date that it rose in that position could be discovered by using astronomy. In the case of the ancient Egyptians, what was needed was our recognition of how they identified Hydra. And here we have it. It's easy to imagine that a multi-headed winged serpent might represent a great snake constellation suspended in the night sky. Hydra is the largest of all constellations and was shown as a multi-headed winged serpent in the tombs of the ancient kings of Egypt for 300 years. Thutmose III, 1425 BC. His son, Amenhotep II, 1400 BC. Seti I, 1279 BC. Ramses VI, 1137 BC. From what has been presented so far, we now know that Hydra was portrayed as a great flying snake by many ancient civilizations. But when exactly during 10,390 BC was it visible in Egypt in the pre-dawn sky? By using our computer program again, we regenerated the positions of the stars over Egypt as they appeared in those ancient times. And as we scrolled through the months, looking at the pre-dawn sky, it was on September 15th that the position of the constellation Hydra was horizontal in the sky, matching the way it was painted at the top here in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. We discovered that it was also possible to pinpoint the exact day by paying attention to that head at the tail of Hydra in this tomb painting. The ancient Egyptian astronomers represented planets as gods, and that head at the tail of that serpent is a god. With this in mind, we considered the positions of planets in relationship to Hydra. And you can see here we have Venus right at the tail. Above that we have Saturn. Above that we have Spica. Below that we have Neptune. There's Pluto. The only star, the only planet that was a candidate to be the head of the god at the tail of Hydra on that date was Venus. Our computer program shows that Venus was the only planet in the vicinity between September 16th and September 25th of that year. Venus was in Libra, and the midway point between September 16th and September 25th is September 21st. That's the autumnal equinox, and that's a significant day for astronomers. Most probably, we realized, these ancient astronomers were targeting the autumnal equinox. September 21st, 4:50 a.m., 10,390 BC, in the sky over Cairo. But there's more proof. More astronomical proof is to be found within the tombs of these same kings in an ancient Egyptian book painted in their tombs called the Book of Amduat. This ancient book gives the position of the first star of Hydra rising at 120 degrees over the gateway of the horizon. Using our computer program, we discovered the date was September 21st, 10,390 BC, when this star was in this position, as recorded in the ancient Egyptian book of Amduat. This year agrees with the year that Casey gave for the completion of Giza and the sealing of the Hall of Records. Casey's transcriptions, for various reasons, are often awkward and difficult to understand. Someone who received a reading from Casey once asked if the readings could be made easier to understand. The answer Casey gave was, learn to understand them better. The ancient Egyptians did not look at the world the way we do. They seem to have combined two or more ideas with respect to their concepts of gods and heavenly bodies and other celestial beings in a manner that doesn't match the way we look at things today. But perhaps the answer is to understand them better. They were good astronomers. Their knowledge of the stars predates present-day historical estimates of their civilization. The Egyptian civilization has been estimated to have begun about 5000 BC. But since the rising of the first star of Hydra on the horizon was recorded in their texts as 120 degrees in the tombs of the kings of Egypt, and since the only time this ever happened during the current 26,000 year cycle of precession was on September 21st, 10,390 BC, the implication is that the beginning of Egyptian civilization could be at least 5,000 years older than has been previously estimated. And if consideration is given for the amount of time necessary for the evolution and development of astronomy, the Egyptian civilization could be much, much older. So far, during this presentation, we have identified three Sphinx guardians of the Hall of Records: the Great Sphinx, the constellation of Centaurus, and the constellation of Leo. I know what you're all thinking. Is that all of them? There is another guard not specifically mentioned as a guard in the readings, but it is shown in the ancient Egyptian texts. Above the seated figure of Osiris, the text reads, Osiris upon his throne. Written upon the pyramid, the throne of Osiris. This illustration is from an ancient Egyptian papyrus that belonged to a princess of Egypt in 950 BC. It shows a serpent guarding the tomb of Osiris, which is at the top of a pyramid. The Casey readings explain there is a tomb in the upper chamber of the northeast corner of the first pyramid building, and the Hall of Records is in the northwest corner of this same pyramid. This illustration of a serpent guarding a pyramid was found on a 21st dynasty coffin discovered in Thebes. The hieroglyphs show the throne of Osiris and the zenith of the constellation of the serpent above the interior of the sacred place of his tomb. And at the bottom of this picture, we show the characters separated from the illustration, and you can see the throne of Osiris, the Egyptian word that means culmination of a star, the pyramid itself, the little heart symbol that means interior, and the three figures that mean sacred place, and of course the figure of a mummy, which indicates a tomb. This next illustration is the serpent guardian of Osiris, and guess where it's from? I know what you're thinking, Ed, and you're exactly right. It's from the 7th division of the book of Amdawa, from the tomb of the Valley of the Kings. Written above Osiris on his throne, it says, the dead body of Osiris. Written behind the serpent, it says, hail this god in the serpent's embrace. Written above the head of the serpent, Osiris, who is in the embrace of Apep. And written in front of the serpent guardian of the body of Osiris. Now, I'm just guessing, but I think these Egyptians were trying to say that this was the serpent guardian of the tomb of Osiris. Having fun with my mic. Got on my glasses, isn't that silly? It's all this holding. Once we begin to compare the history from an astronomical perspective, our scale of measurement expands exponentially because of the vastness of time involved in measuring celestial changes. This shift of reference in time exists within the readings, where we find allusions to terrestrial time, but also to zodiac time. For example, few people who have studied the Casey material realize the time scale discussed within the readings given for a woman identified only as Miss 993. One of her readings explains that the date for the construction of the first pyramid at Giza was in the neighborhood of 250,000 BC, which equates to somewhere between 9 and 10 cycles of precession. Remember earlier I told you a cycle of precession was about 26,000 years. The readings explain that Giza had been submerged for nearly 250,000 years since civilization had been in that part of the continent. From Casey's readings, we learn that a nomadic group of people entered into Egypt in the 11th millennium BC and through archaeological research discovered the remains of monuments and structures created by an unknown previous civilization that had flourished there long before their arrival. After this wandering tribe had settled down into the Nile Valley, the readings explain that they unearthed monuments from time to time and added to them. Remember earlier I said they began to build upon the mounds? Some of these monuments are still existing. From an astronomical perspective, in the scheme of an infinite universe, 250,000 years is not long at all. But from the position of historical orientation on Earth, it seems quite outside the realm of realistic possibility that a civilization existed, that even existed in Egypt that long ago. However, recent archaeological discoveries have brought to light the existence of a prehistoric culture in Egypt nearly 1,000,000 years ago. This information can be found in Michael Hoffman's book, Egypt Before the Pharaohs. Turning our attention to a historical account of Egypt, we find documents inscribed upon the walls of an ancient Egyptian temple located on the west bank of the Nile in the city of Edfu. These inscriptions provide information on the myths and religion of ancient Egypt. The text is very obscure in parts, but there is allusion to a fight against a snake that took place in the sky. Other references are to the primeval ones. The general definition of their nature was that they existed before everything else. They shaped their own bodily appearance and they were radiant. The appearance of these divine beings resembled animals, such as falcons, lions, snakes, and bulls. There is no doubt that these were star constellations. By using our computer star program, we have learned that the year 10,390 BC was in the zodiac age of Taurus the Bull. This may indicate the date to which these ancient records were referring because in the Edfu text, the first mention of the appearance of these primeval ones resembled bulls. The text of Edfu also explained that after the death of the first sacred mythical world, new inhabitants came into the region and discovered the ruins of a former civilization, and they rebuilt it. Once again, the Edgar Cayce material is in agreement with historical documents found in Egypt. Cayce said, "There was even then the seeking through those channels that today are called archaeological research, when there was the entrance of era art and era art, they began to build upon the mounds they discovered through research." In his book titled The Complete Pyramids, Mark Lehner, former ARE member, explained that the Pyramid of Khafre was built in two separate sections. Professor Lehner indicated that the top of the pyramid was a different construction style than the lower base, and he suggests this might be because there was a stop in the construction and then later a resumption of building. Right on, Mark. This information that has been presented to you today, all you great folks, thanks for coming, is from the Edgar Cayce readings, ancient Egyptian texts, and astronomy. These three places, when taken together, indicate that the location of the Hall of Records is not under the Sphinx, but at the top of the middle pyramid on the Giza Plateau in Egypt. It seems that we need to put more effort into trying to understand Cayce in a broader context. There are difficulties in dealing with Cayce, and even well-researched ideas like this one, guess what, might turn out to be wrong. Let's not forget how easy it was to assume that the Hall of Records was located in an underground corridor preceding from the paw of the Sphinx. This concludes our lecture, and we thank each of you for coming. Thank you.